Part 2, Chapter 14. It looked different than he thought it would. Taller, more like an apartment building than a hospital. But then again, what did he know about hospitals? Weren't they just places people went to die? Standing at the entrance to the Halifax Rehabilitation Center on the first day of August, Reeve felt someone dance on his grave, goose flesh marching up his back and arms despite the warmth of the morning. He hoped the grave dancer was his grandfather, hoped he was dancing somewhere hot, red flames licking his toes, while the soles of his feet singed and charred, then fell away from his bones and blood-blackened silvers. Something wrong? Colville asked. No. Reeve moved forward, and an electric sensor opened the door. Colville followed him inside. A man in his early 60s met them in the foyer. Hi, I'm Jim Granter. You must be Mr. Colville. We spoke on the phone. Frank, Colville said, shaking his hand. Pleased to meet you. He turned to Reeve. This is Reeve Kennedy. Jim Granter was the polar opposite of Frank Colville. Where Colville was tall and trim, Granter was short and fleshy, at least 40 pounds overweight. Where Colville's hair was thick and dark, Granter's was sparse and threaded with white. But what Granter lacked in physical stature, he more than made up for in exuberance. His voice was filled with music, and every sentence seemed to end with an exclamation point. Reeve, my boy, he said. Glad to have you here. We always have room for volunteers. Yeah, Reeve mumbled. Granter took Reeve's hand and pumped it 4 or 5 times, then clapped him on the shoulder and led him towards the elevator. This young man will be fine here with me, Frank, he called over his shoulder. We'll take good care of him. He pressed the call button, and the doors of one car immediately slid open. He and Reeve stepped inside. Reeve felt as if he'd been hijacked by a sidewalk Santa on speed. He kept his face forward, tried to ignore the heat that was working itself up to his neck to his face. Colville was standing in the foyer watching him, and even from the elevator, Reeve could see a muscle twitch at the corner of his mouth. The son of a bee was trying not to laugh. A-hole. So I'll be back around 4 to pick you up, okay? Said Colville. That's just dandy. Granter enthused. He turned to Reeve. Tons to do, my boy. Tons to do. And don't you worry, we'll feed you. The elevator doors began to close. Good luck, Reeve, Colville called. Bite me, you bee. When the elevator arrived at the 5th floor, Jim Granter was still talking, and Reeve felt like the target of a firing squad, a barrage of words instead of bullets pelting him endlessly. Granter was himself a volunteer. I'm the greeter, he said. Granter the greeter, they call me here. He'd explained that he came to the rehab at least a couple times a week, and more often when new volunteers were expected. As they stepped off the elevator at the 5th floor, Granter was outlining for Reeve the various levels in the facility. The first floor included the X-ray department and the cafeteria. The second floor contained the physio gym and pool. The third floor was a general recreation area, and the 4th floor housed occupational therapy and several doctors' offices. The 5th floor contained more offices and the cardiac rehab program, and the 6th floor was the musculoskeletal trauma unit, which also included beds for patients who had suffered brain injuries. The 7th floor contained beds for patients with spinal cord injuries or who had had amputations and were coming in for prosthesis. The 8th floor, Granter said, was set aside for stroke patients. Following Granter down was a long hallway. Reeve was suddenly overwhelmed by the variety of injuries the human body could sustain. His stomach lifted uneasily, and he imagined Judge Thomas somewhere laughing her head off right that moment. He suddenly wished for the opportunity to inflict an injury or two on her. B-word. Here we are, Granter exclaimed. They'd come to the office of Shelley Simpson, the recreation therapist who was in charge of coordinating volunteers. Her door was open, but Granter knocked anyway. A woman working at the desk looked up and smiled, then got up and came around with her hand extended to Reeve. So you're our newest volunteer, she said as she shook his hand. I'm Shelley. Very nice to meet you, Reeve. In her late 30s, Shelley Simpson was an attractive woman, tall and willowy with soft features and even softer voice. But her handshake was surprisingly firm. In some weird way, she reminded Reeve of a female version of Frank Colville, but he couldn't say why. She certainly didn't seem like an a-hole, at least not yet. But give her time. All any of them needed was a little time. Reeve finished shaking her hand, stood there awkwardly, unsure what to say. I've got more people to meet, so I'll just leave you in Shelley's capable hands, Grantor all but shouted. You take care, Reeve, and he was off. The office was suddenly silent, and Reeve could hear a slight ringing in his ears. He shook his head, and Shelley smiled. Jim is one of the most effervescent people you'll ever meet, she said, pulling up a chair for Reeve to sit in. She sat in one beside it. If that means loud, you're right, he said, glancing around the room as he sat down. Its neatness and organization reminded him of Colville too. Even the frames on the wall, 2 of which held photographs of children, while a third contained a certificate of some kind, seemed perfectly parallel to the floor and each other. Shelley laughed softly. Jim's been helping us out here ever since he retired. 10 years before that, he was one of our patients, which is what makes him such a terrific volunteer. He knows firsthand what goes on in our facility, knows what the patients are experiencing even before they do. Grantor, a patient? What did he break? He was helping a friend build a garage and he fell from the roof to the concrete footing. He broke his back. F word, Reeve muttered, then noticed the immediate disapproval on the woman's face. Sorry, he said. She nodded. You'll have to watch the language here, Reeve. Yeah, he said, thinking of Colville's extra jobs. I've been trying. You just surprised me. I thought a broken back meant you were paralyzed for life. Fortunately, Jim's spinal cord wasn't severed, but his injuries required months of extensive physiotherapy. Must be quite the place, he thought, then realized he said the comment aloud. She smiled. We're very proud of the work we do here, and we're very grateful for the work our volunteers do too. Reeve frowned. Looking down at his hands, he said, You should probably know. She interrupted him. I know you were assigned here by a court order. I don't know any of the particulars, and I really don't care to know them. Reeve looked at her closely to see if she was telling the truth. Couldn't. The only thing I do need to know, she continued, is that you're ready and willing to help out. Our staff is far too busy to babysit someone who doesn't want to be here in the first place. She paused, clearly waiting for an answer to the question she had not asked. If it were up to him, Reeve thought, he'd be heading toward the elevator right now. No, he did not want to be here, or anywhere like it, but it wasn't up to him, was it? And he thought, if he had to be somewhere, it might as well be this place. The sooner he got started with this shit, the sooner it'd be over. The woman obviously mistook his hesitation for uncertainty. If it's any help, Reeve, she said quietly, you're not the first person the court has assigned here. In fact, some of them have turned out to be our best volunteers. Reeve wasn't looking to win Volunteer of the Year at this place, or anywhere else, just to do his time and get out. But there was no need to tell her that. She could think he was Saint effing Christopher if she wanted to. As long as she kept off his back, they'd get along fine. I'm ready, he said. Shelley spent the next half hour explaining the various ways that volunteers helped out. They were not permitted, of course, to assist with any kind of medical or therapeutic procedures, since these could be performed only by qualified personnel. But there were many other duties that focused on improving the quality of life for patients at the facility. Some volunteers, she explained, are more comfortable doing one-on-one work, visiting with patients who don't have families close by, for example. People like that really appreciate having someone to talk to or to play cards with. And in the good weather, volunteers often take them outside for walks or just sit with them for a bit in the sun. She went on to explain that others prefer to work with groups of patients. We have volunteers who do things like get a group of people together and show a movie downstairs on the 3rd floor, make popcorn, things like that. Then there are volunteers who do programs in the evening, bingo for example. And sometimes they bring in people they know who can demonstrate activities like painting, craft design, you name it. Shelley smiled. We even had someone do archery with one group. Besides their involvement with individual patients and organized activities, volunteers also assisted the staff directly. They helped set up barbecues, accompany patients from one part of the hospital to another, help them get their food, and so on. The list is endless. At least you don't have to worry about the time being long. The staff will keep you helping. When she had finished, she asked if Reef had any preferences regarding how he might help out. His preference, of course, was to put as much distance as he could between himself and every gimp in this place. But he thought for a moment. I don't see myself doing things with a group, he said. Maybe one-on-one with somebody. Or I could just help out the staff doing some of the things you told me. I'm sure Jim filled you in already on the different kinds of injuries this facility treats. Any particular floor you think you'd be more comfortable working on? Reef had long forgotten which floor was which, but he knew what he didn't want to do. I don't want to work with stroke patients. What makes you say that? Reef paused, wasn't sure how to continue. Then, my grandfather had a stroke. It's what killed him. Oh, I see. He was sure, of course, that she couldn't see. He'd actually been grateful for the stroke, had in fact once wished it had came sooner. It was one of the things that had finally stopped the drinking, the rages, the flood of empty threats he'd never stood up to, never challenged. Wished he could have, but never did. If he'd believed in God, he'd have thought the stroke was an answer to an unspoken prayer, but he knew it wasn't. Not when he saw what it did to his grandmother. He'd hated watching her look for any sign of improvement, any reason to hope. She'd held her husband's hand for days in the hospital, rubbing it softly, all the while talking to him, telling him over and over that everything was going to be all right. But it wasn't. Not then. Not ever. Even then, the cancer was growing inside her. It just hadn't told anyone yet. I don't assign new volunteers to the 8th floor anyway, Shelley continued. Or the 7th, for that matter. Patients who have had strokes or lost limbs often require a level of patience and compassion that even professionals take a while to develop. Over time, though. That's all right, Reef said. What about the he'd forgotten the term. Musculoskeletal? That's on the 6th floor. How about we put you there to start? Reef would have preferred she put him back on a bus back to North Hills. But that wasn't going to happen. The judge had made sure of that. Fine with me, he lied. After giving him a quick overview of the 6th floor and introducing him to the medical personnel in the musculoskeletal unit, Shelley Simpson had left him with a nurse named Carly Reynolds, who put him to work almost immediately. We can always use another body around here to help out, she said. She glanced at her watch. In fact, I've got a job for you right now. You're on traffic control. He waited for an explanation. In the next few minutes, that elevator door is going to open and 2 wheelchairs are going to come out full tilt. She seemed to notice the surprise in his eyes and laughed. No, I'm not clairvoyant. It's just 2 of my patients usually come up from physio at the same time, and if someone isn't there to stop them, this hallway turns into the Indianapolis 500. As if on cue, the elevator banged and the doors opened, revealing 2 people, a young woman and a man about Carly's age in wheelchairs, each jockeying to be first off. Hold it, Carly ordered, sticking her hand out like a crossing guard. The 2 looked up and grinned sheepishly. Busted, the young woman said. Reef, said the nurse. Meet the bane of my existence, Brett Turner. And this is her partner in crime, Ron Sheffield. Guys, this is Reef Kennedy, hall cop. She punched out the last 2 words for emphasis. Reef here is going to help me make sure everyone observes the speed limit. She leaned toward Reef and murmured, whatever you do, don't get your feet in front of them. Turning to her partner, the young woman groaned. Looks like the hall Nazi has reinforcements. We're screwed. Her partner laughed. So did the nurse. Reeve moved forward, keeping an eye on his feet. It turned out that Brett was as much help as she was hindrance. She gave Reeve a tour of some of the other floors, including the 2nd and the 3rd, where she said the real action was. It was when he saw the physio gym that Reeve began to wonder if he'd be able to handle this volunteering thing after all. The patients he saw there were a far cry from Brett Turner. An old man sat hunched over in his wheelchair, pulling on a rope attached to a weight. And despite the encouragement he was getting from the therapist working with him, and despite the fact the weight couldn't have been more than a couple of pounds, it was all he could do to pull the rope a few inches. To his right, a middle-aged woman was attempting to walk between 2 parallel bars, but had managed a little more than a halting snail-pace shuffle. At the far end of the gym, a man in his late 20s or early 30s was trying to walk up a ramp whose incline was minimal, but even from the door, Reef could hear him groaning with exertion. Across from him on the far wall was a basketball net, and Reef thought whoever had hung it had one Christly sick sense of humor. It was obvious that no one here would be using it. The third floor, which contained the general recreation area, was much less depressing. Many of the walls found on the other floors were absent here, allowing for a large open area beyond the elevators that served as an entertainment center. The room contained 3 large sofas and several armchairs and recliners, separated here and there by tables covered with books and magazines. Off to the left were higher tables on which lay a chess set, cribbage board, and assorted games. To the right was a large-screen projection TV with VCR and DVD player, and near the windows at the far end stood a regulation-size pool table. He thought briefly about Jink and Bigger and knew they'd have a ball on the 3rd floor, momentarily pictured them hanging out there, then shook his head to clear that image. Those two would level the place. He also thought about Scar. Brett reminded him of her, and not because of her hair, where Scar's was the red of Kids' crayon. Brett's was much lighter, more blonde than red. No, their similarity lay more in their manner, completely genuine. What you saw was what you got. During the tour, Brett introduced Reef to a number of patients, most of whose names he forgot the minute she said them. So focused was he on their various physical limitations. It was like a freak show, only free. Many were missing something, an arm or a leg. Others had all the parts, but these seemed to have a life of their own. Or no life at all. Most of the time he looked away, but not from any courtesy on his part. They creeped him out, and every one of them knew Brett. "She's a wild one," warned a bald man with a handlebar mustache who was slowly pushing a metal walker down the hallway. "Nearly knocked me down twice this week already." "Yeah, well, next time signal when you're turning," Brett retorted impishly. Reef was surprised people weren't pissed off at her. If he said that kind of things she did, he'd be sure to get a dirty look, or worse. But everyone she met seemed to enjoy her comments, and many stopped to chat. Watching her carry on with the other patients, he wondered what had brought her to the rehab. Shelley Simpson hadn't told him. He couldn't ask. "So," he said later as he rolled her wheelchair toward the elevator for the ride back up to the 6th floor, "you fall down some stairs or something?" Brett turned to look at him and grinned. "You're not real subtle, are you?" Reef reddened, unsure if he defended her. "Look, or something," Brett said. "Huh? You asked if I fell down some stairs or something." Reef was surprised. "Off a roof?" he asked. "Out of an airplane," she said. "Yeah, right." "No, really, I did." "You fell out of an airplane?" He waited for the punchline. "Well, actually, I jumped." "Look," Reef said, not bothering to mask his annoyance. "If you don't want to tell me, I was skydiving. My parachute didn't open." "You're shitting me." It was out of his mouth before he realized he'd said it. Brett laughed. "No, I'm not shitting you, actually. It was my first time skydiving, Sam. That's my guy. He warned me not to, but I'd always wanted to try it, so I paid to take a course. On the last day, everybody got one jump. Some luck. My only jump, and the chute doesn't open." Reef remembered something he'd seen in the movie. "Ain't there another parachute?" he asked. "The reserve, yeah. It got tangled in my lines." Reef shook his head slowly, stopped pushing the wheelchair, and moved around in front of the girl. "Christ," he breathed. "What was it like? The falling or the landing?" "Jesus, well, both. At first I thought, this isn't happening to me. You know, like those nightmares you have and you wake up drenched in sweat?" Reef nodded. He'd had a lot of nightmares like that when he was younger, and a few since the hearing, since seeing those pictures. "Then I panicked, forgot everything I learned in the course." "No shit. I almost did that too, which when you think of it might actually have made for a softer landing." Reef grinned. "The chick had balls. Big ones." "Then what?" he asked. "Then I got myself under control and started trying all the things we'd been taught, which didn't work." She shrugged. I found out later that what happened to me was just fluky. The main chute almost always works. And on the off chance it doesn't, the reserve takes over with no problem. It was just a weird combination of events. But hey, I guess when you jump out of an airplane, you shouldn't be ready for weird, right? Effing right, he exclaimed, then remembered where he was. It was nearly noon when Reef returned Brett to the 6th floor. They found Carly, who thanked him for keeping the Turner Terror occupied and making the hallways safe for the rest of us. She gave him a lunch voucher and told him to grab a bite to eat in the cafeteria. You know where that is? She asked. 1st floor, right? Carly smiled. You learn fast. You're gonna work out just fine here, Reef. Reef flushed. That was the 3rd time that morning he turned red for some reason or other. Wouldn't Scar have loved to see that, he thought, then realized that was the 2nd time she had come to mind that day. For a moment he wondered where Scar was, what she was doing. Well, Reef, said Brad, I was looking forward to seeing more of you, but there's little chance of that now. He looked at her. Why not? She nodded at the lunch voucher. Carly's sending you to the cafeteria. Clearly the woman is trying to kill you. The nurse raised her clipboard threateningly, and Brett wheeled around and sped down the hallway. Nice meeting you, Reef, she called over her shoulder before disappearing into her room. So how was your first day? Colville asked when Reef opened the door and slid into the truck. Reef didn't answer right away. Finally, okay. Colville pulled the truck out onto Winter Street, came to the lights on Spring Garden Road, and turned right, heading down toward the harbor. What you expected, he asked. You want to play-by-play, asked Reef. You think maybe I should take a video camera next time and tape it for the sharing sessions? Colville didn't say anything for a bit. Satisfied, Reef watched the city slide by. Warm air rushed through the open windows and mingled with the traffic fumes were the undeniable smells of midsummer. Reef thought about Bigger and Jink, wondered what they were doing on such a nice day. Not wheeling gimps around, that was more damned for sure. Or reading to vegetables, which was how he'd spent his afternoon. You have some visitors coming later, Colville said. Reef turned. What do you mean, visitors? Friends of yours, Jim, Scar, and Bigger. Jink. What? Reef breathed aloud. Derisive sigh. Not Jim. Jink. Oh. They drove in silence, and before long, Colville's truck pulled onto the span of the Murray McKay Bridge. He could have taken the McDonald Bridge, but once on the Dartmouth side of the Murray McKay, it was only a couple minutes to the 118 and then a straight haul to Waverly. In a moment, they were high above the water, and Reef could see dozens of sailboats dotting the Bedford Basin to the west, and beyond that, outbound vehicles lined up on Magazine Hill. People playing, working, living their lives. Thought I wasn't allowed to have visitors, he said finally. Traffic on the span was heavy, and a blue Grand Am cut in ahead of them, forcing Colville to brake hard to keep from rear-ending it. To Reef's surprise, Colville showed no impatience, didn't even honk his horn. Not at the beginning, Colville agreed, and no unsupervised visits for the first 6 months. But I thought it might be good for you to see them. I talked to your social worker about it, and he agreed. Reef mulled that over, knew somehow that his continued refusal to join in the nightly whine and whimper was part of this, as if bringing his friends in would get him to open up, make him, how did Colville put it, more likely to disclose. Such BS. Anyway, Greg offered to bring them over this evening for a bit. I told him I thought you'd earned it. When Reef snorted disdainfully, Colville continued, Look, if you don't want to see them, just say the word. Reef turned away, looked east down the harbor past the shipyards, the McDonald Bridge, McNabb's and George's Islands, the Atlantic Ocean beyond them all. Even now, he could see the bank of offshore fog mowing in. It's okay, he said. The truth was, though, it didn't feel okay, though he wouldn't let Colville know that. For some reason, the idea of seeing his friends again suddenly made him uneasy. Maybe it was because he hadn't returned Scar's calls. Yeah, that was probably it. He drummed his fingers on the door frame, watched as the water beneath them fell away and became land.